Hi everyone, and welcome to this new section where we will be discussing performance of aircraft, and we will start doing that by the definition of the different weights. Okay, so in terms of weights we have different definitions depending on when we define this weight, the operation that is related to this weight, and also how this weight will affect the stability and behavior of our spacecraft. Okay. Now let's see. First of all, we have the manufacturer's empty weight, okay, which we'll be discussing later. Then the zero fuel weight, which is kind of intuitive. Maximum zero fuel weight, operating empty weight, takeoff weight, maximum takeoff weight, maybe one of the most important, this one. The payload, the maximum landing weight, and fuel plus reserves. So, manufacturer's empty weight, which is MTOW, is actually related to the weight of the aircraft as it is built. Okay, as it is built. So, this includes the structure, the engines, and the systems. All that is required for the aircraft actually to work. Installations, furnishings, okay, and other equipment are also included. In the zero fuel weight, the ZFW, this is one of the most important also. Weight is actually of the airplane and all of the contents. Only unusable fuel is considered. Okay, so this means that we will be considering for this weight unusable fuel, but not fuel. Okay, as you can imagine from zero fuel weight, right? Zero fuel weight is constant throughout the progress of a flight. Why? Well, because the only thing that changes the weight, okay, is actually the fuel. So you can imagine that the zero fuel is constant, because the unusable fuel is a given parameter which is constant too. Then we have the maximum zero fuel weight, which you can imagine is the maximum weight allowed, okay, before fuel and other propellant agents, such as the injectors or other additional liquids, are loaded. Okay, so the idea here is that maximum zero fuel weight is actually a parameter for an aircraft to be allowed to fly. Okay, so if we need a certain amount of propellant, certain amount of fuel, we will have to make sure that the maximum zero fuel weight is met. We have the operating empty weight, OEW, which this one actually includes the crew, all engine liquids, and all the equipment for flight. So this one is a kind of complete, but it does not include the usable fuel and the payload. So you may ask what the difference between the operating empty weight and the zero fuel weight is, and the idea is basically that this includes the crew. So flight crew, cabin crew, everyone, okay, which is required for the flight, and it does not pay, okay, for that flight. So this is the idea. Now what else? Takeoff weight. Takeoff weight depends on the range intended for flight. So if you want to go to a very close city, of course you will need takeoff weight which is defined in some way that is different from going, I don't know, from Los Angeles to Qatar, okay? So this one is an important parameter to take into account when designing the range and designing the flight from one point to another. This is also defined as the weight at takeoff, okay? And it includes payload and all usable weight. So this means all the people which will go into the flight, okay? And this implies that for each time, if you're going to a flight, when you do the check-in and all of that, they will consider an average mass for you, okay? And they will include it in the payload. And therefore, you are kind of included in the takeoff weight that they actually need to resolve, okay, before going into flying, right? So this is kind of a parameter which depends on the people that will go there. And of course, there's a lot of parameters such as considering that one, I'm not sure now, but I think it was 1, 2, 3% of the people will not appear on the flight, okay? And you have to include that, in terms of the payload. So it's kind of interesting parameter. This one is the most important in terms of the design of the flight itself. Okay. It also includes all other usable weight. Okay, so cargoes, or the amount of people who have who said that will take an extra baggage, etc., etc. You also have a maximum takeoff weight, which is the maximum allowable takeoff weight. All right. So maximum takeoff weight at which the pilot is allowed to take off. This is kind of a bit different. The idea for maximum takeoff weight is the limit, okay, of the structural loads which can be loaded, okay, for the aircraft. So if you actually, the maximum takeoff weight is a given point, it's a given parameter, okay. If you exceed this point, you're probably charging, or you will have, it may be, okay, that you may have structural problems regarding the aircraft itself. Sometimes this has been a problem, okay. Not taking care of the maximum takeoff weight may be a really big problem if you're considering some, any kind of flight. You have to take into account the maximum takeoff weight, and that's it. Okay, this is the idea. Now, the maximum landing weight is kind of intuitive also, is the maximum weight at which an aircraft is allowed to land. It can condition, of course, the times of flight. Okay, so sometimes you just imagine that you take off and you still have a lot of weight. You need to kind of rotate, you need to move around the aircraft for some fuel to get expelled of the aircraft, okay, and then you will reach the maximum landing weight, which is obviously clearly it is less than the maximum takeoff weight, okay, and when you reach this point, then you will be allowed to perform a landing. Okay, this is kind of an interesting. I know some people who asked me, why do we keep just rotating sometimes and not getting into landing? Well, it may depend on the weather, okay, it may depend on many other factors, but one of these factors is this one, okay. You need a maximum landing weight, and this is just defined by all the requirements and restraints and constraints which are regulatory, okay. It's all kind of under some laws, under some conditions, and you just have to meet them, okay. What else? The payload is the carrying capacity of an aircraft, and it includes people, cargo, and extra fuel. And finally, the fuel is just divided into usable fuel, okay, taxi out fuel, and reserve fuel. As you can imagine, the usable fuel is the fuel which will be used for the performance of the flight. Taxi out fuel would be the fuel used when moving or when doing taxi operations on the ground, on the airport, okay. And finally, a reserve fuel, which has to be defined, and you always need reserve fuel, which is 5% of the total usable fuel.